So it seems that Games Workshop have finally done it, and with the digital points update for the Chaos Knight Codex, they're giving the big knights some absolutely enormous points cuts to finally try and make them worth taking versus swarms of war dogs. Let's look in on Games Workshop's Chaos Knight release and how it went, and talk through the points cuts for the big boys. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the Chaos Knights. And in the aftermath of the Codex going up for pre-order, I thought I'd check in on a couple of things: how Games Workshop sales went, and whether or not people were keen to buy lots of War Dogs in the hand-packed lance. And it now seems that thanks to Games Workshop sending out digital points to content creators, we now basically have a full points list of the new Chaos Knights. And basically the upshot there is that War Dogs are pretty well the same, but every single Titanic Knight got some pretty enormous points cuts that I do think is going to absolutely shake up the faction in terms of balance between the two. Looking on the Chaos Knight sales first though, it does appear that the Houndpack Lance, the Battleforce box set with 7 War Dogs, has been less popular than the vast majority of other battle forces recently. It doesn't really strike me that Games Workshop's likely made any more of these compared with normal, but it more feels like the demand has been kind of low. There's really been quite a lot of negative sentiment around the Codex that did maybe seem a little bit misplaced before points costs came out. But also I think it was a box set that was going to be useful to some but not others. If you collected Chaos Knights, there's a good chance you've got so many War Dogs already that another 7 is just going to be too many. And if you're new to the faction, I feel like it's a pretty reasonable pickup, but at the same time it's buying absolutely loads of the little guys all in one go, when you might want a bit more of a balanced start with maybe say 1 big guy and 2 small ones, and then build up from there. In any case though, for whatever reason, Games Workshop haven't sold out of these, which is unusual given that they seem to at least sell out in the UK and USA for the vast majority of these individual faction launch Battleforce box sets. And in general, for people who actually wanted one, that's pretty good news. It means you actually have the option to pick one up. A fair few of them are even still going at discount, which is a bit rare recently. I'll leave some links to a whole bunch of sponsors and channel affiliates around the world who have still got some at discount. Looks like in the UK I had the most trouble finding some. Out of channel affiliates, Element Games was sold out, though has the Ruinator Knights for 20% off. Firestorm Games still seems to have some, which I'll link, but there's no discount versus Games Workshop, so a bit disappointing there. Feel free to give some shouts out in the comments if you can find more there. In the USA, Wargame Portal has some stock of the Houndpack Lance at 10% off currently. The lower discount is due to it being a second wave item, so discount rates are far lower. In the EU and Germany, Tash and Geldeep still has some left at a big 20% off. They often tend to be pretty good for Battleforce stock. In Canada, Fenris Workshop has some at 10% off, and Toy Snowman still has the Ruinator Knights for 15 if you're looking for those. And then in Australia, Gap Games and Warhouse both still have Ruinators left, but none of the Battle Forces unfortunately. So it does seem that Games Workshop still haven't really given the discount retailers all that much supply of the Battle Forces. Seems that some places around the world, as ever, have done better than others. In any case, I'll link them down in the video description if you'd like to check any of those out. And a big thank you to anyone using the channel links to pick up Warhammer things when you do. It does help to support Auspex Tactics. Sales of War Dog boxes aside, let's talk about the Titanic Knights though, which to say from this update does finally seem to be Games Workshop delivering on the constant criticism that they've had for Chaos Knight balance for around about 3 years or so now. Literally ever since the faction came out in 9th edition and all the way through 10th since, it seems that War Dog spam has been the best way to play the army. Just take something around about 12 to 14 of the little knights, depending on exactly what the points cost was, and just giving the enemy a whole bunch of skirmish armoured holes to deal with. It just felt like a particularly sore spot with Warhammer balance, given that in most of the rest of the edition, they haven't really done an awful job of trying to make the majority of each codex playable, at least far better than the vast majority of Warhammer editions prior to now. It just seemed odd that Chaos Knights had such a clear faction balance issue, when points cost could have just been used to fix it very easily, but for some reason they repeatedly chose not to. Now though, it looks like we know those points cost, and the digital points cost have been shared around from the Chaos Knight Codex. Games Workshop basically post them out to content creators, so Goonhammer and Art of War and people, and then when their reviews go live, people collate those points and share them around the internet, so there's plenty of places that are sharing entire points lists of Chaos Knight digital points now. So far, whenever we've got these content creator style points, they have just been exactly 1 for 1 with the digital download that Games Workshop winds up releasing for them. Maybe just a couple of things perhaps lost in translation for people misunderstanding, or a few points being lost in translation, but these are certainly good enough to be relied upon, and basically it means that the big knights got way cheaper. Games Workshop have been gradually chipping away at the Chaos Knight points from one balance update to another. I believe at the start of 10th they started around about the sort of 420 to 450 sort of points, and after several points decreases they're now down to more sort of 365 to 400 or so. Pretty much if you wanted to play the strongest version of Chaos Knights, they were basically suboptimal to War Dogs, even the cheap ones. I still felt like most of the Titanic Chaos Knights maybe weren't crazily behind for more casual games, and plenty of people did make say one working competitive, but usually War Dogs carrying the vast big strength of the list. Now though, it looks like in particular the Titanic Chaos Knights have just got enormous points reductions, and unlike previous balance updates, it hasn't just been 10 or 20 points here or there. Across the board they've gone down by huge amounts. Basically the standard abhorrent chassis in the Codex are now all between 325 points and 350 points, so even the most expensive now being slightly cheaper than the previous cheapest. It does feel kind of crazy to get an entire Knight chassis for just over 300 points. It seems at least pretty possible that the Imperials could get similar. Going through the list of them, the Knight Desecrator is 335, all the way down from 400, a big 16% decrease there, and basically unchanged in the Codex bar stat lines. It's got good generalist melee and a big punchy anti-tank gun. It's a nice generalist and still looks like one of the better ones. The Knight Abominant is the cheapest at 325 still. That hasn't dropped quite as much proportionately, but did get a fairly solid boost to its gun. It now has 12 shots with the big Volkite rather than 9. Still going to be very unreliable as a big weapon, but it's still got the draw of being the single cheapest Knight out there. It does have fun special rules as well. The Battle Shock debuff is a relevant one with the faction rule. The Knight Despoiler is also looking seriously scary. 335 points for the flexible Questoris style Knight. My first thought with these is the dual Gatling cannon and Storm Spear rocket pod in the Infernal Lance. That's the one where you can get basically lethal hits on your firepower just inbuilt, only taking a small chance of mortal wounds. At 335 points with that sort of pretty oppressive general purpose firepower, I think I'm a bit apprehensive that that one's going to be too strong. It absolutely murderizes infantry with 36, strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 shots, plus some rockets and flamers on top of that, and if you give that lethal hits it's going to be killing a battle tank in a turn as well. They've also got a stratagem in Infernal Lance for ignores cover there. The Knight Rampage is down to 335 points. Again, that seems absolutely excellent. That's the Rush Melee Knight with an enormous amount of damage. Throwing that amount of wounds up the board with the easy capacity to break just about whatever it touches makes that look pretty terrifying. It did lose its once per game inbuilt advance and charge though, which is significant. I'd still say that points drop probably outweighs that. Kind of weirdly enough, the least exciting one looks like the Knight Ruinator, the new kit. That one just didn't seem like the most exciting profile in the world versus the other knights out there, and for some reason it's the most expensive. I feel like it'd probably still be slightly overshadowed if it was the same cost as the rest, but it's a little bit more. I guess it's got an interesting buff for War Dogs at least, but beyond that I'm a bit apprehensive about that one being any good at the moment. Finally though, the Knight Tyrant drops down to 395 points. That gets the biggest relative points decrease out of any of them. And again, just for the sheer firepower that can do, that does look interesting now, I'd say. It was one of the more overshadowed knights out of the rest of them. Its durability did get worse by not having a 2+ save anymore, just having a 3+ and dropping down to toughness 12. But I feel like that's the sort of thing that you can bear out when it's now less than 400 points. Kind of crazy that these were above 500 recently and now less than 400 for basically the same firepower, potentially better with sustained hits in Infernal. I feel like that's easily enough of a relative points cut to offset the durability hits that it took. Overall, it's just a massive across-the-board buff for Chaos Knights. Talking of durability, that's one thing that people weren't so happy about in the Codex, maybe more so for the War Dogs and Tyrants, perhaps more than the Abhorrent class ones, but still people weren't very happy about those being at toughness 11 and easier to wound with las cannons, even if they gained wounds. As I said in the Codex review, I would have argued it was a side grade, not a downgrade, even if they'd stayed the same points cost. Versus Strength 12 las cannon fire, they're basically around about 89% as durable as before, and then Strength 6 basically goes from just not really affecting them so much to actually being a viable source of damage. I guess you're near enough twice as much damage with that one, though maybe that's a little bit of a misleading statement given that it just wasn't really effective at all before, so twice of not much still isn't crazy. In any case, they're definitely less durable per model versus those two sources, but given the buff up to 26 wounds, it does mean that they're tougher against almost literally everything else. Basically an extra 18% more durable against things like mortal wounds, big scary strength 14 anti-tank, melter weapons, plasma weapons, all the low strength things with lethal hits that you might threaten knights with, or things with the anti-vehicle 3+ keyword like Chain Fist for example. Basically between all that, I would have argued that there's a few more things that can interact with them better, and while they have lost toughness against an important class of weapons, against the vast majority of things the Titanic Knights just gain a significant boost to durability. There are other things to consider as well though. Diabolic Bulwark is a big loss for most of the detachments out there, but it is still intact for Infernal Lance, so it's not lost there, and if people wind up playing that one as one of the more common ones, then it's still very much intact just as it was before. And interesting to see that the Chaos Knights picked up a very easy army-wide durability boost. If you're playing against any sort of gun line, then you probably pick the Darkness Dread ability turn 1, and that means that you're -1 to hit outside of 18 inches, and that's a pretty excellent army-wide buff against gun lines. It's definitely going to affect some things more than others, but if you're worried about strength 12 firepower, a lot of las cannon equivalents are probably going to be hitting you from further away, and that seems like it's a direct mitigation to that. Obviously though, that was all very theoretical, and that was before we knew points cuts, and maybe thinking they were going to be about the same sort of points. Now they've all dropped by somewhere between around about 10 to 15% or so for the Abhorrent class knights. Their durability per point seems to have gone up massively. Taking a look maybe at the Balanced Desecrator and Despoiler type chassis, they went down from 400 points to 335. Previously, to kill around about 500 points worth of knight, you'd expect around about 5 or 6 las cannon shots at ballistic skill 3+ to be needed for that, going at their 22 wound toughness 12 profile with a 5+ invulnerable save, and rising up to 7.3 if you use Diabolic Bulwark for the 4+ invulnerable. Now though, if you've got Darkness active, their 26 wound profile and their massive points cut, to kill 100 points worth of knights you now need around about 7.8 ballistic skill 3+ las cannon shots, so if you're firing them with the -1 to hit debuff, basically every single knight on the board is tougher than a knight with Diabolic Bulwark, at least in terms of damage the enemy can expect from points gunned off the table. That's never mind the fact that you can still use that in one detachment, and there are other durability stratagems out there. Basically, if you're shooting a las cannon at long range versus a Desecrator, if you weren't using Diabolic Bulwark, essentially they've gained around about a big 40% durability between the -1 to hit, the extra wounds and the points cut, and across an army they're 7% more tough than even knights with Diabolic Bulwark were. That's maybe being a tiny bit generous with the -1 to hit thing, but at the same time we could be comparing to all the things that aren't a strength 12 las cannon, maybe strength 10, strength 14 or mortal wounds. For all of those accounting for the extra wounds and also the points cut, the knights are around about 40% tougher, so just a ridiculous slog for a bunch of units to try and chew through due to those extra wounds, and you can now afford more big knights to put on the board. Otherwise, for the other classes of knights, Wardog points are kind of similar. They definitely got some changes that felt more like overall nerfs. Dropping down to toughness 9 did feel like it was more impactful than the toughness 11 change to me. Strength 5, strength 9 and strength 10 will all have better profiles against War Dogs now. Though again, it is still somewhat of a side grade against everything else, including las cannon profiles that people were so concerned about for the big knights. They're essentially plus 70% more durable against those, and the same for other small arms, mortal wounds, or big scary anti-tank profiles. Feels like maybe the more clear-cut nerfs to the War Dogs, with the OC having dropped down to 6 and degrading now, and the Demon Breath Spear dropping down to 18 inches, both of which definitely make them less flexible. Seems that the vast majority of their points cost are unchanged though. The only one that's dropped down is the Brigands, going down to 140, but that definitely lost out rules-wise, dropping down to ballistic skill 3+, a shorter range on the Demon Breath Spear, and traded out its special rule for a worse one in my opinion, but at least it's got a fairly healthy points cut to go with all that. I still say that the most likely standout one is probably going to be the Carnivore, which doesn't really feel like it lost all that much in all these changes. It's no longer weapon skill 2, but it gets sustained hits 1 just inbuilt automatically, and that means that for the average Carnivore it's still going to be hitting with just as much power as it did before. Pretty good stuff given that it was one of the most efficient damage profiles in Warhammer 40k in a whole bunch of targets point for point. The Stalker feels like the other interesting one on paper to me. Gaining Scout was quite a big deal. I feel like that still makes it very interesting even though the Demon Breath Spear drops in range. The Huntsman's still very dangerous too, rerolling wounds against vehicles and monsters, and the Executioner and Brigand still do some alright firepower and are both at least fairly cheap now. I would guess though that given these guys stayed roughly where they are and there were some really big points cuts to the big knights, they will actually finally gain some significant ground on them, perhaps particularly in the context of several detachments that seem to support the big knights extra well versus the small ones. Finally, these are the apparent points costs for the Forge World Knights. I would guess that at some point in the future, the Imperial Armour Index is going to have some kind of update, as otherwise you're going to have Wardog Moiraxes with toughness 10 more than the rest, and the rest of the big knights be toughness 12 when you sort of expect them to drop to toughness 11 if they're dropping in line. It still does look like they've got similar sort of changes here though. The Wardog Moirax is slightly cheaper, still more expensive than the other ones though. The Questor Megara and Styrex are both reportedly 345, but perhaps most interestingly the Sevastus Knights are 355, and depending on the exact changes that things like the Atropos and the Lancer get, they could be seriously quite interesting indeed. Feels like they still compete very well, and certainly compete far better with the War Dogs dropping down as many points as that. Finally, for points reveals, they've also got the enhancement list that's been shared around as well. Seems that these points came from Goonhammer. The majority of the enhancements are sort of 20 points to 35 points-ish, depending on their strength. I say most of them don't seem like they're crazy standouts, perhaps just for sheer value. 10 points for Warpborn Stalker and the Lords of Dread seems like a particularly amazing one. That's the one where you can vanish at the end of the enemy turn and then deep strike somewhere. Means that you could have something like a Knight Tyrant or another Shooty Knight just literally just warp into line of sight for something they absolutely want to wreck. For 10 points that just seems like an utterly auto-include upgrade. The Veil of Medringard is pricey but certainly seems worth it in the Traitoris Lance as well. It seems that one's 35 points but gives you a permanent 4+ invulnerable save at range and a 5+ in melee. Overall though, between all this, I'd certainly expect big knights to be back on the menu. It is kind of interesting that you can do a list with 6 big knights now, should you wish to. At 2,000 points, one of them must be an abominant, as there's not enough wiggle room for one not to be. But then for the other 5, you actually have a fair amount of flexibility. You can choose basically any 5 of your choice between Despoiler, Desecrator, Rampager, and Abominant. They're obviously not going above the maximum of 3 of any one datasheet rule. That means that you could have 6 big Titanic guys striding up the board, doing good knightly things and a massive amount of damage. That'd certainly be a really intimidating prospect on paper for a whole bunch of opponents, I suspect. You could have something like Abominant, 2 Rampagers, 2 throw up the board for melee, 2 Desecrators for some big anti-tank, and then more general purpose knights following along. Maybe a Gatling Despoiler to hose down some infantry. That would take you up to 2,000 points on the nose. You wouldn't have any room for any of the good enhancements with that though, unless you went for multiple Abominants. I think in reality though, it's almost certainly going to be a better idea to go for some kind of a balance. It just makes sense to have some small units running around in Warhammer 40k to add to mission things, and maybe try and screen some big blows that might have felled big knights. You can still take a lot of each though. You could have 4 big knights with 4 war dogs and some demon support like this one. Maybe this one going for Infernal Lance to maximise those lethal hits, double Gatling Despoilers. You could have 3 of those for around about 1,000 points. Then perhaps a Knight Desecrator with a Knight Diabolus enhancement. So that's a big hitting anti-tank, and then he hits really hard in melee as well with that enhancement. And then some War Dog support with a Stalker for Scout. 2 Carnivores for rushing forward with some big melee. An Executioner to do some grunt work, and maybe screen or hold down a home objective. And a couple of swarms of Nurglings to screen out the mid-board or do nuisance things. Otherwise, for the rough shifts in what you could do around about 3 big knights, plus it looks like roughly 6 war dogs at their new prices, and that still gives you some points available for enhancements and demons. Or you could drop down to 2 big knights plus 8 or 9 war dogs, and still have some points left for support, potentially quite a lot if you went for 8 war dogs. Overall though, really nice to see some actual genuinely good support for the Titanic Knights. I feel like this one actually does give a pretty good example of waiting for the points to assess a Codex. I feel like Codex Chaos Knights just reads far better, knowing that the big Knights are a lot cheaper than they used to be. It feels like the War Dogs are going to be maybe a bit relatively worse given that they stayed the same points, but that might not be the worst thing in the world to actually make them being used for their supporting role. At least some of them were not quite as tempting just for primary damage and defense maybe. With points decreases like this though, I do wonder if Games Workshop's partly selling a few more Chaos Knights at us. I think people wouldn't have been against the big Knights both being a bit scarier and also more expensive in points, as opposed to being able to do weird 6-knight army lists, just because they aren't quite as impactful on the table as you'd guess they would be. In any case though, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'll leave this one there for now though. As mentioned, feel free to check out the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description if you're looking to pick up some Chaos Knights, whether they're Ruinators or the Handpat Lance Battleforce or the Codex and things. A big thank you to anyone using those when they order in some stuff. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day, and I'll certainly aim to keep up with Games Workshop's news and reveals. If you've enjoyed all the videos, then check out the Patreon page as well. That's another direct way to support. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.